There is a specific kind of loneliness that does not come from being unwanted. It comes from being too much, too intense for the room, too honest for the relationship, too far ahead of the conversation to pretend the conversation is enough. Friedrich Nietzsche knew this loneliness from the inside with a precision that would have destroyed most people. And in a sense, it did destroy him. But before it did, in the long decade between the abandonment and the collapse, he built something that the people who left him could never have imagined. Something so dense, so sharp, so philosophically consequential that it is still reshaping the way human beings think about themselves 130 years later. He did not become unstoppable because he was gifted. He became unstoppable because he had nothing left to lose. And there is a specific kind of power that only becomes available to a person who has lost everything they were afraid to lose. This is that story. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in R246, Kecken, a small village in Prussia. His father, a Lutheran pastor, died of a brain ailment when Nietzsche was 5 years old. His younger brother died 6 months later. Before he was 6 years old, Nietzsche had already learned that the people you love disappear without warning and without reason, that the universe does not organize itself around your need for stability, that you can be left suddenly and completely with no explanation that satisfies. He carried that lesson into everything. He was a prodigious student by the time he was 24 years old, before he had even finished his doctorate. He was offered a professorship in classical philology at the University of Basel. It was an extraordinary appointment, unprecedented for someone his age. And for a brief period, it seemed like the world was going to reward his extraordinary mind with a place in it. It wasn't. The academic life never fit him properly. He was too restless for the careful, incremental work of scholarship, too interested in the big questions, too unwilling to stay within the boundaries of his discipline. He began writing philosophy while he was supposed to be writing classical scholarship. And the philosophy he wrote was not the kind that earns institutional approval. His first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1872, was met with almost total rejection by the classical establishment. His colleague Ulrich von Willamowitz-Moellendorff published a scathing public attack on it. Student enrollment in Nietzsche's courses collapsed. The book that was supposed to announce his arrival as a major intellectual voice instead announced to the academic world that he was not a serious scholar. He was 30 years old, and the institution had already decided he was a problem. But none of that was the wound that made him. The wound that made him was Wagner. Richard Wagner was the most famous composer in Europe when Nietzsche met him in 1868. He was 24, Wagner was 55, and from the beginning there was something between them that went beyond admiration. Nietzsche saw in Wagner the living proof of what he was beginning to theorize. A man who created not for the academy, not for approval, but from some volcanic interior necessity. Wagner was loud, grandiose, impossible, and magnificent. And Nietzsche loved him with the kind of devotion that very intelligent people reserve for the first person who seems to be operating on their frequency for nearly a decade. It was the most important relationship in his life, and then it ended. Not with a fight, not with one devastating betrayal, it curdled. Slowly, the way milk curdles. Wagner became more nationalist, more anti-Semitic, more interested in spectacle than in the depth Nietzsche had believed was the foundation of everything. The final break came after Wagner wrote Parsifal, a work Nietzsche saw as a capitulation to Christianity, to sentimentality, to everything he believed great art should destroy rather than reinforce. He wrote to Wagner. Wagner did not respond in any meaningful way. The silence was its own answer. Nietzsche never saw him again. Wagner died in 1883. Nietzsche found out secondhand. He described the rupture as losing a father for the second time, and then, in the years after Wagner, came the departures that completed the isolation. Salomé arrived in Nietzsche's life in 1882 like a specific kind of catastrophe. She was 21 years old, Russian, intellectually extraordinary, and utterly unwilling to be anyone's anything on their terms. Nietzsche fell in love with her with an intensity that was almost violent. He proposed to her twice, both times through an intermediary, because he could not bring himself to do it directly. She declined both times. She wanted intellectual companionship, not marriage. She wanted freedom. She was, in many ways, the only person Nietzsche ever met who was genuinely his equal in conversation, and she did not want him the way he wanted her. His sister Elizabeth, who despised Lou with a jealousy she barely bothered to conceal, helped engineer the destruction of the relationship. Through a campaign of letters and whispered accusations that poisoned whatever possibility remained, by the end of 1882, Lou was gone. Paul Ray, his close friend who had introduced them, was gone. His relationship with his sister was shattered by the residue of the disaster. In the winter of 1882, Nietzsche wrote to a friend that he had reached the maximum of suffering, that he was not sure he could survive it, that the pain was not metaphorical but physical, a specific crushing weight in the chest that he could not write around or think past. He was 38 years old. He had lost his intellectual father. He had lost the woman he believed was made for him. He had lost his closest friend. He had lost his health to the migraines and digestive agony that had been dismantling him for years. He had lost his academic position, which he had resigned in 1879. He had lost most of his readers who found his writing too aggressive, too strange, too much. He had lost his faith, which had gone earlier in ways that left specific kinds of emptiness that faith leaves when it departs. He was alone in a way that most people never experience and never have to. And then he sat down, and he began to write. Between 1883 and 1888, in cheap boarding houses across Switzerland, Italy, and France, moving constantly because he was always looking for the right altitude, the right light, the right temperature. To ease the pain in his head, Nietzsche wrote the books that would define the next century of Western thought. Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In 4 parts, written in a white heat of creative intensity that he described as inspiration in the most literal sense, as if the words were arriving from somewhere outside him, and he was simply the instrument, beyond good and evil. On the genealogy of morals, Twilight of the Idols, the Antichrist, Ecce Homo, the astonishing, strange, almost terrifying autobiography he wrote in the final weeks before his collapse. He wrote all of it alone. He wrote all of it in pain. He wrote all of it without an audience, without a publisher who believed in him, without a colleague who understood what he was doing, without a partner who could witness it, without a friend who could carry it with him. He wrote all of it because he had nothing left to protect. And that is the key. That is the thing that the abandonment gave him that comfort never could have. When you have something to lose, your thinking is compromised. Not always consciously, but you are always somewhere beneath the argument, calculating whether this thought is safe to think all the way through. Whether this conclusion is one you can afford to reach. Whether the people who matter to you can accommodate what you are about to say. You pull your punches without knowing you are pulling them. You stop 10% before the real edge. You round down. You soften. You protect the relationships with your moderation. Nietzsche had no relationships left to protect, and so his thinking stopped moderating itself. He went all the way to the edge of every idea, and then he went past it. God is dead, not as a provocation, as an observation with devastating consequences for the entire architecture of Western morality. The will to power, not as a celebration of domination, but as a description of the fundamental drive of all living things toward the expression of their nature. The Übermensch, not as a political program, but as a philosophical invitation to imagine what a human being might become if they stopped letting inherited values do their thinking for them. Master morality and slave morality, the eternal recurrence, the revaluation of all values. These ideas were not developed in comfort. They were not produced in a supportive environment by a man who had people around him to catch him if he fell too far. They were carved out of rock by a man who was already in free fall and had decided that falling was the only honest way to move. There is a letter Nietzsche wrote in 1885 that stops your breath when you read it. He writes about his books, specifically about the fact that they are not selling, that almost no one is reading them, that the ideas he believes to be the most important philosophical work being done anywhere in Europe are meeting with total silence. And then he writes something extraordinary. He writes that he has decided to write for a reader who does not yet exist, that he is writing for the next century, that if his ideas are true, and he believes with complete conviction that they are, then they will find their audience eventually. He just will not be alive to see it. He wrote that without self-pity. He wrote it as a statement of fact. This is one of the most psychologically extreme positions a human being can occupy. To create something enormous, to pour everything you have into it, to believe in it with total conviction, and to simultaneously know with near certainty that you will not live to see it validated. Most people cannot do this. Most people require at least the possibility of recognition to sustain the effort. The possibility that someone will see, that someone will understand, that the work will be received in their lifetime. Nietzsche had removed that requirement. He had looked at the situation clearly, saw that the timeline did not favor him, and decided to keep building anyway. That is not optimism. That is something colder, something rarer, the willingness to do the work without any guarantee of the reward. To accept that the value of the work is intrinsic to the work itself, that it does not require witnessing. Schopenhauer had taught him part of this. Nietzsche discovered Schopenhauer's The World as will and representation as a young man and described the experience as a thunderclap. Here was a man who had said the most honest, most uncomfortable things about human nature and the human condition without softening them for the room. Who had looked into the abyss of existence and described what he saw with methodical precision, and who had done it alone, largely without recognition, for most of his life. Nietzsche inherited that willingness, but he took it further. Where Schopenhauer's response to the darkness of existence was essentially resignation, a wise and compassionate withdrawal from the relentless striving of the will. Nietzsche's response was transformation. He wanted to know what a human being looked like on the other side of all the loss, after the God is dead, after the values collapse, after the relationships dissolve and the institutions reject you and the audience never arrives. What is left? What becomes possible? What can be built in the rubble? His answer was the Übermensch, not a Superman in any comic book sense, a human being who has passed through the destruction of inherited values and built new ones from the raw material of their own experience. A person who says yes to life, not because life has been kind to them, but because they have decided, as a philosophical act, to affirm existence, including its worst features. He called this amor fati, love of fate, not acceptance of what happens, love of it, the decision to want what happens, including the losses, the abandonments, the migraines, the empty lecture halls, the unreturned love. To look at all of it and say, I would not change a single moment, because each moment was necessary to produce what I am now. Nietzsche arrived at this not as a feel-good conclusion, but as a hard-won philosophical position that cost him a decade of suffering to reach. He did not love his fate easily. He raged at it. He grieved it. He nearly broke under it, but he arrived at amor fati on the other side of the grief, not as an avoidance of it. And that perhaps is the most important thing his story teaches. The transformation was not despite the abandonment, it was because of it. Not because suffering is inherently ennobling, it is not suffering breaks most people. It makes them smaller, more fearful, more defended. It teaches them that the world is dangerous, and that closeness ends in loss, and that hope is a trap. Suffering produces bitterness far more reliably than it produces wisdom. But there is a specific kind of suffering that can produce something different. The suffering that comes when you have already decided you are going to keep going. When the loss happens and you grieve it fully and you do not use the grief as a reason to stop. When you let the abandonment strip away every external support until the only thing left is the work itself. And you discover that the work itself is enough. That it was always enough, that you had been performing partly for the audience all along, and now that the audience is gone, the performance falls away too. And what remains is something purer, stranger, and more powerful. Nietzsche's final decade of work has that quality. There is no performance in it. There is no accommodation of what the reader might want. There is only a man thinking as hard as he can about the most important questions he knows, with nothing left to protect and no one left to disappoint. That is what the abandonment gave him. Permission. Permission to be fully, dangerously, uncomplicatedly himself. And that permission produced beyond good and evil. It produced the genealogy of morals. It produced Zarathustra and his eagles and his serpent, and his teaching that the human being is something to be overcome. It produced the idea of eternal recurrence, which asks whether you are living in a way you would choose to live again, infinitely, forever, with no escape and no revision. It produced amor fati and the will to power and the death of God and every other enormous, consequential, still reverberating idea that Nietzsche carved out of the rock of his own suffering. None of it would exist if Wagner had stayed, if Lou Salomé had said yes, if the Academy had embraced him, if his health had held, if comfort had found him. The losses were not obstacles to the work, they were the conditions of it. By January 1889, Nietzsche's mind gave way. He collapsed on a street in Turin. The stories of what happened vary. Some say he saw a horse being beaten and threw his arms around it. Some say he simply fell. What is clear is that when he was carried back to his room, and when his friends arrived, and when the letters he had written in the final days were read, it was obvious that something had broken. The mind that had produced the most uncompromising philosophical work of the century was gone. He lived for another 11 years. He never wrote another coherent sentence. He was 44 years old when it ended, and his books were just beginning to find their readers. By the time of his death in 1900, Nietzsche was famous across Europe. The very ideas the Academy had dismissed, the ideas he had written in pain for an audience that did not yet exist, were being read, debated, fought over. They were influencing literature, psychology, political theory, art. They were doing exactly what he believed they would do, just too late, just beyond the edge of his ability to witness it. That is the part of the story that most people do not want to sit with, because it complicates the narrative. The narrative we prefer is that genius is eventually recognized and the visionary is eventually vindicated in a way that allows them to feel vindicated. That the suffering pays off in a visible, satisfying way within the lifetime of the person who suffered. But that is not always what happens. Sometimes the transformation is real, and the work is real, and the contribution is enormous, and the person never gets to know. Never gets the letter that says you were right. Never gets the conversation that says I was wrong to leave. Never gets the moment where the room fills up, and the silence is replaced by recognition, and the decades of lonely work are confirmed as worth it. Sometimes you build the thing, and you never see the building stand. Nietzsche built the thing. He never saw it stand. And yet the building stands. It has been standing for 130 years. It is still standing. It is still being argued with, still being misread, still being discovered by young people in boarding houses and libraries and late nights who pick up "Thus spoke Zarathustra" and feel something they have never felt before, the sense that someone finally said the thing that needed to be said, that someone looked at the whole comfortable, inherited, unexamined structure of values and meaning and said, "This is not enough, we can do better, we can go further. We can become something that the current version of ourselves cannot even imagine." He did that without an audience. He did that in pain. He did that after everyone left. And the question his story asks of you is not whether you are Nietzsche. You are not. Nobody is. The question is smaller and harder and more personal than that. The question is what you are doing with your loss, not what you're doing with your success. Not what you are doing when the room is warm and the people are present and the support is real. What you are doing with the specific cold of being left, of being misunderstood, of having the person who was supposed to see you look through you instead, of watching the institution dismiss you, of feeling the friendship dissolve without a reason good enough to justify the grief it leaves. Are you letting it make you smaller, or are you sitting down? And beginning, Nietzsche sat down, and what he built in the silence of his abandonment is still here, still speaking, still finding the reader he wrote for. The reader who does not yet exist, until now.